Welcome to today's lesson, Inheritance Patterns in Humans. It's pretty easy to study organisms like pea plants, which Mendel did, or fruit flies, which many scientists did, because they have few chromosomes, they reproduce quickly, it's easy to look at multiple generations in a very short time, and there's few ethical considerations related to their study. For example, if I take a purple-flowered pea plant and I cross-pollinate it with a white-flowered pea plant, there's no ethical issues to consider. If I was trying to study humans instead, now that would bring up ethical problems. I wouldn't be able to set up a controlled experiment. So human studies involve historical records. Here is a family. This is Queen Victoria's family in England, and her family is famous because they carried a disease called hemophilia. Hemophilia is a disease in which individuals can't clot their blood properly, so they could bleed to death from a small cut. And there were 18 descendants of Queen Victoria who had hemophilia. So scientists have studied that family extensively. Now, geneticists also create little pictures or charts like this. They're called pedigrees, and they allow scientists to see how diseases run in families and make predictions for future generations. And we'll look at pedigrees later. Inheritance of genetic diseases is quite complicated. There's about 6,000 genetic abnormalities in humans that follow a Mendelian inheritance pattern. However, most human traits are polygenic. They're influenced by multiple genes, sometimes many genes, like hundreds of genes at the same time, so it's very complicated. And traits can also be influenced by environmental factors. It turns out that based on what you're exposed to in your environment, your genes can work differently. Certain genes can be turned on and off based on environmental factors. This is the field of epigenetics. Alleles that cause severe mutations are actually, fortunately, quite rare. There's four main patterns of inheritance that we're going to look at today: autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked recessive, and X-linked dominant. It's helpful to remind ourselves of what autosomes and sex chromosomes are so that we understand what autosomal is and what X-linked is. So 1 through 22 in our chromosomes, and remember they're paired because we get a set from mom and a set from dad. But 1 through 22 are our autosomes. They have nothing to do with sex. So there's diseases that affect these chromosomes, and they're called autosomal diseases. And it doesn't matter with these diseases if you're male or female, you're equally likely to get those genetic diseases. The sex chromosomes are X and Y, and we're going to look at certain diseases that run on this X chromosome that are linked to the X chromosome, and those diseases typically will affect males more often than females. The first type is the autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. A trait associated with the dominant allele on an autosome appears in people who are heterozygous as well as those who are homozygous. They appear in every generation of a family, and they occur in equal frequency in both sexes. Since these diseases are dominant, if you have a capital allele for dominant and you have a lowercase allele, those individuals will all be affected. Here are some diseases that have autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. Achondroplasia is a form of dwarfism that's a dominant autosomal disease. Polydactyly, which is extra fingers or toes. There's Marfan syndrome, hypercholesterolemia, which leads to high cholesterol running in families. Progeria is premature aging, very drastic version of it. Huntington's disease, which is a degeneration of the nervous system. So we're going to look at a pedigree that involves autosomal dominant inheritance, but first we have to figure out what the symbols on a pedigree mean. Squares stand for males, circle stands for females. Anything that's shaded in is an affected individual. An individual who has that trait or that disease. Anything that's blank is an individual that's unaffected. Vertical lines indicate a new generation. So here's a couple. That vertical line indicates their new generation. They're two kids. Horizontal lines indicate a couple that produces a child. Whether or not they're married doesn't matter. It's just that they had a child together. Any slash through a symbol means that that individual is deceased. Half shaded or the circle in the middle indicates an individual who's carrier, who isn't affected but who is a carrier. So here is a pedigree for hypercholesterolemia, and this is an autosomal dominant disease. You can see that it's appearing in every single generation. It's not able to be silent or hidden because it's a dominant disease. It also affects males and females in roughly the same numbers, so there's if there's 1, 2, 3 males affected, 4 females, it's never going to be perfectly the same, but it doesn't seem to skew towards one sex versus the other. Here's another example. This is a pedigree showing polydactyly, which of course is an extra finger or extra toe, in this case a finger. And you can see once again, no generations being skipped, and we see both males and females being affected. An autosomal recessive pattern, in this situation, a recessive allele on an autosome is expressed only in homozygous people. So you need 2 lowercase letters. You need homozygous recessive to actually express the disease. These traits can be silent for a generation. They can skip generations. Both sexes are usually are equally affected because this is autosomal, has nothing to do with sex. People who are heterozygous for the trait are called carriers. Carriers have the allele but not the trait itself. Here are some autosomal recessive diseases: albinism, which involves absence of pigmentation. There's cystic fibrosis, phenylketonuria, sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, and you can look into each one of these. Here's a pedigree showing albinism. This man has albinism, and this is a family with this trait. You can see there's a female here who was affected. These are her children, right? And again, the vertical line shows us that we're going to the next generation. And this line here shows us that that's the male that she reproduced with, right? And anytime they're horizontally connected, that means it's somebody from outside the family. They're not brother and sister. They're producing children together. And we can see that this isn't a recessive disease because it's able to skip generations and show up later. That's the characteristic of a recessive disease. And we know that it's not sex-linked because, again, we see males and females both affected. So this is autosomal. X-linked disorders are disorders that are associated with alleles on the X chromosome. The human X chromosome carries about 2,000 genes, which is almost about 10% of the total number of genes that humans have. Most X chromosome alleles that cause genetic disorders are recessive. So they're mostly X-linked recessive disorders that we're going to see and that we're going to actually use as our examples. And this is partially because diseases caused by dominant X chromosome alleles tend to be lethal in male embryos because males only have one X chromosome. So let's look at how this happens. X-linked recessive disorders occur more frequently in men than they do in women. Remember, men have an XY. They have only one X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes, the XX, so they can be heterozygous for a recessive allele, in which case they do not express the trait. So even if a female ends up with a mutated allele on her X chromosome, she still has an extra X chromosome that could be normal and hide the mutated allele. Men don't have that. If they have a mutated X chromosome, they're going to express the trait. Men can transmit an X-linked allele to their daughters, but not to their sons. Only a woman can pass an X-linked allele to a son. Here are some diseases that show an X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. There's red-green color blindness, hemophilia, muscular dystrophies, as well as some other ones. Here is one of the most common ones. This is color blindness. The image on the right is what a person with normal vision will see. The image on the left is what a person with red-green color blindness would see. These numbers here are parts of a standardized test that is used to diagnose color blindness. There's actually 38 circles that are part of the test, and these are 2. So if you see a 29 here, you have normal vision. If you see a 7 here, you may have one form of red-green color blindness. Here you should see an 8, but if you see a 3, you might have a form of red-green color blindness. And this is actually quite common. And since it is an X-linked recessive disease, it's more common in males than it is in females. Here is a famous case that I've mentioned earlier. This is hemophilia in the royal family. And clues to see that this is recessive, and that, first of all, clue to see that this is actually X-linked. You can see that there's only males that appear to be affected that actually have hemophilia. Females are carriers here, right? Males can't be carriers because they have only one X chromosome, but females have 2 X chromosomes, so they can be carriers and not express the trait. So that's a good sign that this is a recessive X-linked disease. And again, it's not a dominant disease. Those are very, very rare. Usually X-linked diseases are recessive. And the last one X-linked dominant, this is extremely rare. Males with the trait pass it on to their daughters and none of their sons. So males pass it on to their daughters and not to their sons. A female with the trait may pass it on to both daughters and sons, and every affected person has a parent with the trait. There's not going to be a lot of pedigrees that we look at with X-linked dominant. This is an idealized pedigree. It's not a real one. It's like a hypothetical one that somebody made up, and this is what it would look like, because very few diseases actually follow this inheritance pattern. But here are two examples that follow this pattern. Fragile X syndrome, which comes with mental impairment and heart defects, and incontinentia pigmenti, which results in abnormalities of skin, hair, teeth, and eyes, as well as some neurological problems. So I hope that was a helpful introduction to how diseases run in families and the inheritance patterns: autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, and X-linked recessive. Thank you so much for listening.